Perhaps one of the biggest challenges of our day is that we now live in a social media connected society. During this time of lockdown, that's been such an advantage for so many of us, where we've been able to FaceTime with friends or family, Zoom church, and different ways of being able to connect when in times gone past we might have been restricted to the home. But the flip side of a social media connected society is that we become a society that becomes more and more detached. I've sat in restaurants where I've looked at a couple out for a meal together, a romantic meal out, with both of them sitting there on their phones and not actually communicating with each other, not doing eye contact. I watched one couple for an entire meal stay on their phones and not speak. Now, either they'd had a row and they were avoiding each other, but actually it's part of the malaise of our society, isn't it, that we live in a disconnected society. For many of us, our experience of fathers has been a bit like that, where for many of us, our fathers haven't been present. That might have been a literal absent father, where we grew up, where we didn't know our father, or our mum and dad went through a divorce, so we were separated from our father, or we had a bereavement where we lost our dad. And for some of us, we've grown up without really knowing a father relationship because father has been absent. But for others of us, dad might have been there, but emotionally he wasn't there. There was no touch, there was no feel, there was no intimacy. Or quite simply, there was no quality time. Dad was always absent or busy with other things. And some of those things are the opposite of what Father God is like with us. But because of our human experiences, we transfer those things onto our understanding of a relationship with a father. This is something I have to hold my hands up to, and no, I don't get it right. One of the challenges of doing bite-sized Bible has been just to see how many of the characteristics of God I fall so far short in myself. I'm sure if you spoke to my kids, they would say that they would wish that sometimes I was more present. But actually, I'm not always there when I am there because my head's elsewhere. Work or family or other things are so distracting, or so much going on in my head, that actually sometimes it's a challenge to be there. And many of us grow up with that sense where we believe what we're doing is more important than being. And we have a learned behaviour where we find our identity through achieving, through doing things. And the reality is that's a lie of the devil, where we have to do something in order to be accepted. Actually, the truth is, it's okay to be you. This whole question of being present is something that, because of our human experiences, it's very easy to transfer onto a God that we cannot see and think that God is far away and distant and not close with us and not with us. And I hope that what we can see as we look at our passage today, but actually God's very much with us on a day-to-day basis. In Mark chapter 4, we have one of the famous stories of Jesus. If you grew up in Sunday school with children's songs, you probably learnt the song that said, with Jesus in the boat, you can smile at the storm, smile at the storm. Maybe you grew up singing that song. In Mark chapter 4, we have the account of Jesus being asleep in the boat. They've been hard at it as a ministry team. They've been out, they've been serving people, they've been teaching people, and then they get into a boat. The disciples, some of them were experienced fishermen, probably at least a third of them were fishermen. So they would be extremely familiar with boats, they would be familiar with storms, they would be familiar with sailing. And when they get into the boat, they get into something which is familiar to them, and they set off across the Sea of Galilee. Jesus has been busy, he's tired, he goes to sleep. And I guess for all of them, having been busy, there's probably a bit of reduced capacity in them, where after serving and giving out so much, they're probably a little bit frazzled, they're not quite present, they're not quite there. And suddenly this storm hits, and they find themselves afraid. Fear is gripping them. And that's probably because of their reduced emotional capacity from having given out. But they're terrified. And in the middle of this storm, they turn to Jesus for strength. They look to Jesus for encouragement, and they cry out to Jesus to rescue them. The great part of this story that so many of us grew up knowing was that Jesus is with us in the storms of life. It's a tremendous picture that in a crisis, God is there with us. He's present and he comes through in a crisis. And that's many of our experiences. Can you identify with that? Can you identify times where, when things have been desperate, you've cried out to God and God has come through, an answered prayer, a situation that was resolved, somewhere where you didn't know how you were going to get through something and suddenly there's a way through? Many of our experiences of God is that he's been Jehovah Jireh, he's been the God who provides, he's been the God who takes us through things. But for many of us, that sense of, is Jesus present with us? Is God the Father present with us when we go through things? Sometimes our human experiences shape our perception of God being present. And as we continue to look at this idea that we are in a relationship with a God who isn't like a lot of us in human terms, who's distracted and distant and not present, actually God is very different and he is present with us. But maybe let's just reflect for a moment on our own experiences and how much of that do we transfer onto a relationship with God?